It's draft week. The Pittsburgh Steelers have been linked everywhere. Quarterback, running back, defensive tackle, wide receiver, which I've heard that Matthew Golden is a name to watch in your eyes. We'll get to that in a second. Potentially random names like Nicky Muare. There's been, Gray Zabel was a name that was dropped on me during the Senior Bowl. And every time I talk to any source inside that building, he's a name that continues to come up. I'm like, why? Doesn't make any sense for an offensive tackle unless they're thinking Broderick isn't the guy. But we're here. We're 3 days away from the NFL draft. And I think everybody's wondering the same thing. If you were the Steelers, what would your advice be? Or if you were a draft expert, a draft analyst talking to Pittsburgh, what would your advice to the Steelers be? So I want to ask you, best draft mind I know, what is your advice to the Pittsburgh Steelers this week?
Yeah, I kind of have 3 bullet points of things that I would like for them to do or avoid doing. I think number 1 is pretty simple. Don't reach on a quarterback. I completely understand the need at the position, how important it is to long-term success in the National Football League. At the same time, this isn't a great quarterback class. The only guy that would be available at 21 that I would even consider, depending on how the board fell, would be Shedeur Sanders. With Sanders, there is a lot to like in terms of from the neck up. There is a polish to his game. I love the accuracy to the first and second level. He's extremely tough, willing to push the ball down the field. I think he processes defenses pretty well, rarely fooled, takes care of the football. The athletic tools kind of limit the upside of the ceiling a little bit, in my opinion, lacks the drive velocity that you ideally want. Yeah. He has good creative instincts, but he doesn't necessarily create extremely well out of the pocket just because he's a little limited in terms of speed, agility, the quick twitch elements. But just don't reach on a quarterback. The Jackson Darts, I understand Jalen Milroe is kind of the lottery ticket, but even at 21, that's a little bit rich for my blood. So those guys, I would try to stay away from those. And then the other 2 things are pretty simple in terms of they need to start a contingency plan long-term for eventual post-Cam Hayward defensive trench work. They got to find a defensive tackle. They need a starter really this year, somebody that can contribute right away. This is an excellent class to do it. I had a dozen interior defensive linemen in my top 100 on my big board. It is a rich class. You want a 0-tech, a 3-tech, pass rusher, run clock, or whatever you want, you can get in this class. And then the last thing what I would say is just try to add some type of explosive element to the offense. I think that could come in the form of a running back. It seems like a lot of the running backs they've been linked to pre-draft visits, speedsters, explosive play generators, guys like that. They already kind of did that a little bit with DK Metcalf. I think that Jaylen Warren will look more like he did 2 years ago if he's able to stay healthy. And I'm excited about pairing another running back with him to kind of combine those skill sets. But I would just say the last thing is just try to figure out a way to get more explosive plays. Najee Harris was a really solid back, but wasn't a guy who created a ton of explosive plays in the run game. So if you can find a way to get somebody that can do that, especially off outside zone, I'm all for it.
If you are the Steelers, at what point are you looking at a running back? Because they brought in guys. They brought in Omarion Hampton. They brought in Trey Henderson. I would imagine they have interest in Judkins, and obviously they brought in Caleb Johnson. Ashton Jeanty falls, there's no question, but he's not going to make it outside of top 6.
Yeah.
Where are you looking for a running back? Because there are guys in the 4th, maybe the 5th round that have upside, but I don't know if the upside meets you could get a Hampton or a Henderson that have, people are talking Jahmyr Gibbs upside in those guys. Yeah. Where are you looking?
Yeah, it seems like the league really loves TreVeyon Henderson based on what I understand. I'm probably not in the first round territory with Henderson. I do really like what he brings to the table in terms of a pass catcher, awesome pass protector as well. Yeah. You mentioned Omarion Hampton. If they were able to somehow come away with another 2nd round pick, I would pick Caleb Johnson in that category. I think Johnson is an outstanding scheme fit. Tons of outside zone work against Iowa. He has next level type of vision in terms of finding cutback lanes and things like that. He's another guy who created a lot of explosive plays, even though people are really hung up on the 40 time. But like you mentioned, the interior defensive tackle class, I would say interior defensive tackle, running back, and edge. And it's difficult with edge because there aren't usually a lot of day 3 players that go on to have good NFL careers just because if it's an athletic-based position. But those 3 positions are ones where you can go into the 4th round, and I think there's going to be really good contributors, man. Baseline starter types with upside. Defensive tackles, I really like CJ West from Indiana, Jamari Caldwell from Oregon. They had him in for a pre-draft visit. If those guys get to the 4th round, I would be really big fans of that pick. You mentioned running backs. guys like Bashal Tootin and Jaden Blue, explosive play generators. Tootin has a lot of outside zone experience. Blue was a guy who ran primarily outside the tackles at Texas. And then, I don't see them going to need an edge rusher, but there are a couple like day 3 edge rushers that I'm like fringe top 100 guys that I look at. I'm like, man, I'd love to have this dude in black and gold. So, yeah, the depth of this class, especially at some of the positions of their like where their needs fall, really matches up well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think defensive tackle, quarterback is really the only one. Your thoughts on the wide receiver class? Because you said explosive, and I think there's a ton of upside in Matthew Golden, Emeka Egbuka, who seems to be a question mark. Like, outside of that, is there anybody that you're grabbing that? Because the big thought at wide receiver is at some point, what if they have to trade George Pickens, which right now they'd like to keep him. They don't get to determine that if he doesn't show up to training camp. So if they do walk away, like, where is that line for you at wide receiver where it makes sense compared to, all right, you just got a 5th wide receiver and you don't need that guy?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of smart analysts and draft folks, talk about like there's no such thing as a bad wide receiver class. And I do agree to an extent, but this is a below average crop of players. I feel like there is a pretty significant dip in terms of like my top 5 or 6 guys into like the day 2 guys, honestly. But it kind of does depend on like what archetype you're searching for. You mentioned Matthew Golden. The verticality, the burst off the ball tracking with the ball in the air. He plays bigger than his size suggests. He's got the in-out quicks, good route runner, can separate. There's a lot to like with Matthew Golden. He would be a guy that I would consider in round 1 if he was there. Doesn't seem like that's going to be the case. It seems like the league's pretty high on him. You mentioned Emeka Egbuka. There's just a lot. There's a lot to like with Egbuka's game, man. Like, he's just so dependable, so quarterback friendly, works back to the ball extremely well, finds a soft spot in zones, and also like as a blocker, like. The dude, I compared him to Robert Woods. He was one of my favorite players coming out of USC when I first got into like the draft, like putting my thoughts out on Twitter, like not writing about it. But he reminds me a lot of Robert Woods, and people will remember like Woods for his days and with the Rams, and he was a really good player, man, early in his career. So that's kind of the guys that I would probably look at earlier. Now, if like they got to the 3rd round and they still hadn't picked up a receiver, they want like some type of George Pickens contingency plan. For somebody to maybe complement that. A guy like Savion Williams out of TCU is really intriguing. There's a lot of upside present there. He is a little bit of an older prospect, unrefined, unpolished, but makes some jaw-dropping catches at the high point. He can leap extremely well. He's really creative with the ball in his hands. They put him in the backfield sometimes. There's been Cordarrelle Patterson comp, so I think he's going to be Arthur Smith's like favorite player in the draft. But he's somebody that you just got to find. Like, he does get off press coverage like better than maybe you'd expect for like this kind of, I would say, archetype of player, like what people refer to as gadgety. But there's a lot to like. He's got really good balance. He's strong. So I do think there's upside there, but he's going to be somebody that you're going to have to bring along a little bit slowly because I don't think he's really nearly close to being a finished or refined product.
Yeah, I think I feel the same way. I put out a mock draft yesterday, just a hypothetical. Like, what if Aaron Rodgers doesn't end up in Pittsburgh? How should the Steelers approach this? And he was my pick in the 3rd round, actually. The 3rd round. And I agree with you. Like, if you're going to replace George Pickens eventually, which I don't want to think that way, but you have to think that way if you're the Steelers. Contingency plans. And if that's the case, like just like you said, his high point is the closest to George Pickens in this draft class, like where it's defined enough, where everything else is defined enough, where you could say, all right, if this guy's got to play 60% of the snaps his rookie season, it works out. But I agree with you. Where's the cutoff? Like, is he the last name on your list where it's like, okay, after this, it's not there anymore?
It's kind of tough because they haven't really shown like a ton of interest in terms of pre-draft visits. The other guys that they brought in, the Iowa State guys, Jalen Noel, he's the guy who you talk about burst off the ball. This dude can really roll. He's a straight line speedster. He reminds me a little bit of Christian Kirk out of Jacksonville. I think he's with the Texans now. Some similar type of play with Noel. He can track the football well down the field. The one thing that I think I don't see as much as other people would know is I just don't think he's as great of a separator underneath, and he doesn't offer you a lot of yards after catch. So I kind of wonder like what his role is going to be at the next level, and if there's enough value in that role to warrant taking him in the second round, which is like where I feel like a lot of people are mocking him these days. Jaden Higgins, you mentioned like another big body threat, maybe somebody that could potentially replace Pickens if you want to go that route. But he's automatic on back shoulders. Like he has magnets for hands, catches pretty much everything thrown in his vicinity. He's like kind of a rhythmic route runner. He's really calculated in his steps. The problem with Higgins is like there's a lot of guys hanging on his back all the time. He just doesn't separate. He doesn't have nearly the explosiveness that showed up. Like the explosiveness in his testing numbers really doesn't show up on film. And he kind of gets by with more like nuance and savvy. I actually wonder if like a big slot role for him is actually better than him playing X, which is like where Pickens has played with the Steelers. But, you know, it's not one of those classes that you're going to feel great about in terms of getting somebody that could be an instant contributor if you select them on day 3. Could it happen? Sure. I'm not as bullish on this as years past.
No, I agree. I definitely agree.